All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You guys have sent us some really cool stuff lately, and this piece you sent, The Evolution of Neural Networks, from Perceptrons to Transformers, this one really piqued our interest.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
So today, we're going on a little journey, you could say,
A deep dive.
a deep dive, exactly, into how these neural networks have evolved over time. I mean, we're talking from those very first early concepts all the way to like the powerful AI that, seems like it's taking over the world these days.
It's really remarkable to see how far things have come.
Absolutely. So to kick things off, let's go back, way back to the 1950s. The material talks about this thing called the perceptron, which was developed by Frank Rosenblatt. And the way they describe it, it's kind of like, imagine teaching a child, right? You're showing them a bunch of pictures of cats and dogs.
Right.
And eventually they start to pick it up. They start to differentiate between the two.
The classic example, yeah.
That basic idea, that's essentially how this perceptron learned from data.
That's a great analogy. And what's really amazing is that the perceptron was inspired by the human brain, this idea of like, can we build an artificial system that learns similar to how we do? It was really groundbreaking for its
It
time.
was like this vision of like machines thinking like us.
Yeah.
But the material also points out that there were some limitations with this early perceptron model.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And they use the example of like trying to get it to tell the difference between an X and an O.
Seems simple enough.
Super simple for us, right?
Yeah.
But for the perceptron, it was like this major roadblock.
Yeah.
And I was kind of curious, why was that such a big challenge for it?
Well, it all comes down to the perceptron's architecture. You see, it only had a single layer of these processing units.
Okay.
So it could basically only draw a straight line to separate different categories of data.
Huh.
And when your data points can't be neatly separated by a straight line, like the shapes of an X and an O, which are kind of intertwined, it just couldn't figure it out. It couldn't learn to distinguish them reliably.
Okay, so it needed something a little more sophisticated than just a straight line, basically.
Exactly. To deal with those more complex relationships, the network needed, well, more layers.
More layers.
Yeah.
Which brings us perfectly to the next step in the evolution.
Right on cue.
The multi-layer perceptron, or MLP.
MLP.
The material clarifies that this is a type of feed-forward neural network, FNN. So could you break down what exactly an FNN is and how it was a step up from that initial, single-layer perceptron?
Sure. So imagine like a series of interconnected pipes, right?
Yeah.
And these pipes are arranged in layers. Data comes in through the first layer, flows to these intermediate hidden layers, and then eventually reaches the output layer. That's like a one-way street.
Mm-hmm.
Data goes in one direction, input to output, hence the name feed forward.
Okay.
And each layer, as the data passes through, it transforms the data using some mathematical functions.
Yeah.
Adding those hidden layers, making it a multi-layer perceptron, that was the key. It allowed the network to model much more intricate, like nonlinear relationships in the data compared to that simple straight line of the original perceptron.
So that's the whole multi-layer part of it.
Exactly. It's all about adding that complexity and depth to the network.
So going back to the pipe analogy, you mentioned transforming the data. What exactly happens in each layer?
Well, think of it like this. Each layer learns to recognize increasingly complex features.
Okay.
The material gives a pretty helpful example. Predicting house prices
Right.
based on, say, size, location, number of rooms.
Yeah.
The FNN takes those as inputs, and it spits out a price prediction.
Okay, cool.
And the transformation happens through, well, it's a bit mathy, but basically each feature in the first layer, like size, location, they get assigned a weight, right? Reflecting their importance in the price. Then those weighted inputs are combined, and there's this thing called an activation function that adds some nonlinearity. So the network can learn those complex interactions between the features.
Okay, so it's getting more complex as it moves through the layers.
Exactly. And then the next layers can pick up on even more abstract combinations of features. Like one layer might figure out the typical prices in different neighborhoods, while another layer combines that with the size of the house to refine the prediction.
So it's like building upon what the previous layer has learned.
Precisely.
Okay, so FNNs, definitely a big improvement, handling more complex problems. But the material also points out that they have a limitation, which is they don't really remember past data.
That's right.
And with that, like feed forward flow, that makes sense. It's all about the current input. But why is this lack of memory a problem?
Because a lot of real-world problems, they involve sequences, things happening in a specific order where context is super important.
Right.
Like think about understanding speech. The meaning of a word can completely change depending on the words that came before it.
Yeah, totally.
But FNNs, they process each input independently. They don't really have a way to handle that temporal information, so they treat each piece of data in isolation, not considering its relationship to what came earlier in the sequence.
It's like trying to understand a joke one word at a time. You lose the context, the flow.
Exactly.
And the material also mentions that FNNs have trouble with complex patterns, like in images and videos. What makes those so challenging for them?
Well, you could technically feed every single pixel value of an image into an FNN,
Okay.
but that would be an insane amount of input, like computationally, very expensive to train.
Right.
And more importantly, the FNN wouldn't inherently understand the relationships between those pixels, like the edges, textures, shapes that make up an object. It would treat each pixel as a separate thing, completely missing the bigger picture.
So those limitations, that lack of memory, the struggle with complex patterns, that really paved the way for more specialized designs.
Absolutely.
So that leads us to convolutional neural networks, or CNNs, which the piece actually calls the masters of images.
Yeah, they're pretty amazing.
So tell us a little bit about how those work.
Well, the material makes a great comparison. Think about how we recognize faces. We're not analyzing every tiny detail, right?
Right.
We're looking for specific patterns, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, how they're all arranged. And CNNs work in a similar way. They have these special layers that scan the input image for small, localized features.
So they're like searching for specific patterns wherever they are in the image.
Exactly. They use these things called convolutional layers.
Mm-hmm.
And those have filters that slide across the image, searching for those patterns, like edges, corners, textures.
Okay.
And when a filter finds a match, it activates.
Huh.
And then as you go deeper into the network, the later layers, they start combining those basic features into more complex ones. So like from edges and curves, it might recognize an eye, or from shading and contours, it recognizes a nose.
It's like putting the puzzle pieces together.
Exactly.
And the material gives some really cool real-world examples of where CNNs are like killing it. Facial recognition for unlocking our phones,
Right.
object detection, which is essential for self-driving cars.
Those are perfect examples. Because CNNs can learn to identify objects and patterns in images, even if there are variations, like different sizes, positions, lighting conditions. They're very robust.
But just like FNNs, the material also points out a weakness of CNNs.
Yeah.
And that's their difficulty in handling sequential data. So why is it that these networks that are so good at processing images, why do they struggle with like a sentence or, data that has a specific order?
Well, the way a CNN is designed, its architecture, it's meant for processing spatial hierarchies, not temporal dependencies.
Okay.
So it doesn't have a built-in way to understand the order of elements in a sequence or to remember what came before.
Right.
Each part of the input is processed fairly independently. It's missing that memory of past elements that's crucial for sequential data.
Okay, that makes sense. So that brings us to the next step in this evolution, which is long short-term memory networks, or LSTM,
LSTMs.
which the piece describes as, remembering the past.
Right.
So how do they actually achieve this memory capability?
Well, the analogy of a memory-keeping system is pretty accurate.
Okay.
Unlike FNNs or CNNs, LSTMs are designed specifically to process sequences and maintain information over time. They do this through these special units called memory cells.
Memory cells?
And those cells can store and update information over longer periods. Think of it like having a conversation.
Yeah.
You need to remember what was said earlier to understand the current sentence.
Yeah, to follow along.
Exactly. LSTMs do something similar with sequential data.
So they can actually look back at previous elements and use that context to understand what's happening now.
Precisely. They have these intricate internal mechanisms, often called gates, that control what's stored in the memory, what's forgotten, and what's passed on to the next step. This ability to selectively remember and use context across time makes them really powerful for tasks that involve sequential data.
And the material gives some excellent examples, like predicting stock prices, which, you definitely need to remember past trends to do that.
Right.
Speech recognition, understanding a sentence,
Another great example.
and language translation, which is, mapping the order and meaning of words from one language to another.
All about the sequence.
Exactly. So these are all tasks where that temporal relationship is super important. And LSTMs were a big leap forward.
Absolutely.
But the material also notes that LSTMs have some limitations.
Yeah, that's true.
One is that they can struggle with very long sequences. Why is that?
Well, as the sequence gets longer and longer, it becomes tougher for the LSTM to hold on to the relevant information